So I'm not only going to talk about what's happening right now on the ground. We'll need some historical perspective and context as well, because we can't disconnect what's happening now from what has happened at least since 1967. So our starting point is the 6 Days War, June of 1967. And what started on the morning of June 5th as a preemptive attack against Egypt, and as far as we can tell, and we can tell pretty much a lot about the war of 1967, that was the intentional intent. That was what Israel planned to do on that morning, was to attack Egypt, because the month leading up to the war, Egypt violated agreements that it signed with Israel post the war of 1956, removed UN peacekeepers from the Sinai, blocked the Straits of Tiran from Israeli boats. As a result, Israel argued that that was a cause of war. Egypt started pouring forces into the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel launched a war, a preemptive war against Egypt. For a host of reasons that you can find elsewhere the explanation, the war expanded to include a ground attack against the Egyptians, and then another front against the Jordanian, and ultimately a third front against the Syrians in the north. By the end of the war, on June 11th, 1967, Israel has tripled its size in territory. And it conquered the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and also the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which were previously under Syrian, Egyptian, and Jordanian control. Now, when it came to the Sinai is a desert, very small population. So it had some issues, but that was the situation in Sinai. Golan Heights, similarly, very small population, a few Druze villages in the north, not a major issue. But the West Bank and Gaza Strip were densely populated. And then, when fighting came to an end, a war that Israel did not plan to include all those areas, Israel had to make decisions. What to do with the newly conquered, acquired territory. And basically, under international law, you had two options. One is annexation, meaning that these territories are now part of the State of Israel. And if they're part of the State of Israel, Israeli law applies to those territories, and everybody who lives in those territories would become an Israeli citizen. This, by the way, happened in 1949. When the 1948 war came to an end after the establishment of the State of Israel, Israel declared that all the territories that were under the control of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces, would become the sovereign state of Israel, and Israeli law would be applied in all those territories. It also meant that everybody living at that moment in those territories would become an Israeli citizen. As a result, about 150,000 Palestinian Arabs became Israeli citizens in 1949. And their descendants until this very day are citizens, full citizens of the State of Israel, with full rights of citizenship. So Israel was confronted with a similar question: what to do with the newly acquired territories? And the decision fairly quickly was made not to annex those territories, with one major exception, which I will talk about in a second, but to declare them as occupied territories under international law. Meaning Israel is responsible for those territories militarily, not the civilian authorities of the State of Israel. I told you there was one major exception. That exception was Jerusalem, because part of the territory that Israel occupied in the war, conquered in the war, was East Jerusalem, which was under Jordanian control. It was part of the Jordanian West Bank. About 2 weeks after the war came to an end, Israel did two things. The size of West Jerusalem before 1967 was about 38 square kilometers. The size of Jordanian East Jerusalem was about 6 square kilometers. It included the Old City and the adjacent neighborhoods right around the Old City. What Israel did is more than doubled the municipal area of the city of Jerusalem by decision of the Jerusalem City Council. And then through an ordinance of the Israeli Knesset argued that Israeli law shall apply to all the municipal territories under Israeli control. Meaning, de facto, that East Jerusalem was annexed to Israel, and Israeli law applied to East Jerusalem. This was reinforced in 1980 when the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, passed the Jerusalem law, which made this a more symbolic gesture of annexation of East Jerusalem. And in fact, more territory was added to Jerusalem, this time on the western side of the border. So the municipal territory of Jerusalem now includes 121 square kilometers. So East Jerusalem was annexed, Israeli law was applied, though the local Palestinian residents did not become Israeli citizens. They became permanent residents of the state of Israel, which is very similar to green card holders in this country. And they do have a path to citizenship, which actually over the past 3 years has become more practical than it was in the past. But this is their situation, but this is beyond the scope of our talk today. And so these were the territories. And they were declared by Israel as occupied territories. But then there were other questions what to do with those territories once Israel was in control. We know, and we have every reason to assume, that the government that was in power in 1967, the Labor government, under the leadership of Levi Eshkol, viewed those territories, except for East Jerusalem, as bargaining chips. They believed that they could achieve, using those territories, a very good agreement. Something very similar to what the Israeli government did after 1956, when it conquered the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and then gave it back in return for what was seen as a very favorable agreement for Israel. So they viewed those territories as bargaining chips. And we can assume that, A, because we know of deliberations that took place in the Israeli government in 1967, but also because Israel lobbied very strongly for the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 242 in November of 1967. And that resolution basically said, I'm not going to read it out loud, that in return for Israeli withdrawal from territories captured in 1967, there will be comprehensive peace in the Middle East. And there came the formula of land for peace. So we can assume that at least at this point, the Israeli government believed that it's going to use those territories as a way to bargain, negotiate the best possible agreement, but yet hopefully a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. But you needed the other side for it, and while the Security Council passed this resolution, including support from the Soviet Union that severed diplomatic ties with Israel post the war in 1967, the Arab world rejected this plan altogether. In a meeting in Khartoum of the Arab League, in late 1967, they issued 4 no's. No negotiation, no peace, no recognition, no agreement, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Israel should withdraw unconditionally, and that's it, in return for nothing. And so there was no diplomacy and no negotiations in 1967. And so in many ways, Israel continued to hold on to those territories. And as it was holding on to those territories, various groups began to have different ideas of what to do in those territories. And those groups are going to be important because they'll have input that is going to be influential until this very day. So just look at any of those maps we can choose. There's a map that says Israel West Bank. That's going to be useful. That's okay. So before 1948, there were a few Jewish settlements, communities, in the territories that would become the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There was one Jewish settlement in what would be the Gaza Strip, Kfar Darom. It was established in 1946, but there were several Jewish communities in what would become the West Bank that were established in the 1940s. 2 of them were on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. And some of them were in what was called the Etzion block, which is, if you look at the map, is just, it's the dark block southwest of Bethlehem.
Which one?
It's, I'm using this one right here. So if you find Bethlehem, which is just south of Jerusalem, there's a block just southwest of Bethlehem. That's the Etzion block. There were several Jewish communities there. All the Jewish communities in the areas that would be controlled by Jordan and Egypt, they were evacuated and were destroyed by the Egyptian armies and Jordanian armies. There was also a Jewish community in Hebron, in the city of Hebron, a very old Jewish community. Most of it was destroyed in 1929 in the massacre in August of 1929, when 67 members of the Jewish community were killed, and then the rest of the community was basically evacuated and cleared. And so when the war came to an end, there was pressure from families that either lived in those communities or had relative parents who lived to return back to their communities. Could be very easy, but remember that Israel declared that those were occupied territories. And international law has something to say about that. So if you would please open up to the first page, which includes a quote from the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, Article 49. This is a crucial document, and in every discussion about the settlements, this comes up. So it's good to have it, so we can refer to it. And as you will see, this article deals with the rights and obligations of an occupying power in an occupied territory. Most of this article, and you can read it, we're not going to read all of it, deals with how the occupying power should deal with the occupied people, the people who lived in this territory, that it cannot forcibly move them, that it has to protect them, so on and so forth. You can read it. But then the last sentence of this article, and this is the crucial one. It says, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. This is what the Geneva Convention says, and Israel is a signatory to the Geneva Convention. Under most interpretations of international law, and this is basically a universal consensus outside of Israel, Israel is not allowed under international law to send its citizens from Israel proper into those territories. And this basically has been the position of the international community, including the United States and the State Department, since 1967. We now know that the legal advisor for the Israeli Foreign Ministry in late 1967 issued an opinion that basically echoed the international consensus, that any such action would be a violation of international law. If you want to find kind of international validation for this position, UN Security Council Resolution 466, which was passed in March of 1979, said that the Israeli settlements in the territories captured in 1967 are in violation of international law, and it quoted the Fourth Geneva Convention. The United States abstained in that vote. It did not veto that vote, which is again an indication that ultimately the United States views this as violation of international law. However, there have been several legal arguments made by Israelis or supporters of Israel who claimed that this does not apply to the case of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And their arguments, they have some arguments. One, they claim that the spirit of the Fourth Geneva Convention was post-Second World War to end European and Western colonialism and imperialism. And they said that the 1967 war simply doesn't fall under those categories because it was a defensive war. It was the Egyptians who caused the war. Israel only defended itself. Therefore, the spirit of the Geneva Convention does not apply. Another argument is that both the West Bank and Gaza were never rightfully under Egyptian or Jordanian control. that they were occupying forces themselves. Therefore, there's not one case of one country conquering territory from another country, and therefore the spirit of the Fourth Geneva Convention does not apply. So these are some of the legal arguments that Israelis have made, the Israeli legal scholars have made. But again, overwhelmingly, the international community does not accept those explanations and views the settlements as violation of international law based on a very straightforward reading of the Fourth Geneva Convention. There have been several cases before the Israeli courts, including the Israeli Supreme Court, regarding those settlements. And ultimately, the Israeli Supreme Court has ruled that in spirit, the settlements are fine. They don't violate the law, though the Israeli Supreme Court is more interested in Israeli law than it is with international law. However, in many cases, the Israeli legal system had to determine whether a specific settlement is legal or illegal. And what the Israeli courts have been looking for is whether the land upon which the settlement is created was purchased legally, if it was confiscated illegally. So these are the type of questions that the Israeli courts have been looking at. So just to throw statistics at you before we go back to 1967, there are today 121 officially recognized settlements in the West Bank. Meaning, under Israeli law, they are legal. But there are 103 illegal outposts in the West Bank, which under Israeli law are illegal. And in many cases, there are orders from the Supreme Court to dismantle and evacuate them. In some cases, it has been done. In other cases, the government has yet to carry out those orders. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So let's go back to 67. So we have groups who, they want to return. And indeed, in late 1967, the Israeli government allowed families who used to live in the Etzion block to return and rebuild communities in the Etzion block. So construction started in late 1967 on Kfar Etzion, which will become the first Israeli settlement now in the West Bank. And the idea here was, it used to be a Jewish settlement. The land was purchased in the 1920s and 1930s legally. And so, the people who were expelled in 1947, 1948, they have the right to return to those territories and rebuild their communities. And if you look back at the Israeli press from late 1967, there was very little debate about the return of those families to the Etzion block. And we're talking about 60, 70 people at that time. Very little debate about that. At the same time, some of the relatives and families who lived in Hebron and still own property in the city of Hebron said, we want to return to the city of Hebron. We are Hebronites. Our families have lived there for 200, 300 years. We want to return. In that case, the defense minister, Moshe Dayan, who met with them, said, no, you can't return. It's too dangerous. Hebron is a densely populated Arab city. If you move back to your homes that are smack in the middle of the old city of Hebron, we will not be able to protect you. This could lead to violence, so we cannot allow you to return. But on Passover of 1968, a more determined group of Jews, some of them American Jews, and who were ideologically students of Rabbi Tzvi Cook, they saw the fruits of 1967 as the true realization of the Messianic plan for the Jewish people. They believed that redeeming the West Bank, which is the core of biblical Israel, was the realization of Zionism at its fullest, and they wanted to settle in all the religious, crucial parts of the West Bank. For them, Hebron, of course, was at the very top, Tomb of the Patriarchs, and they decided to settle there. They had no authorization from the government, so what they did is they decided to celebrate Passover at the Park Hotel in downtown Hebron. They checked into the hotel. They have yet to check out until this very day. So this was the beginning of the second phase of Jewish community in the city of Hebron. We're talking about a few families who were there. The Israeli government and the IDF were alarmed. They felt that it was a security threat. So they asked them to relocate just outside the city of Hebron. And in fact, built for them a new settlement, which is a suburb of Hebron. It's known as Kiryat Arba, now home to more than 10,000 settlers. So some of them moved to Kiryat Arba, some stayed in Hebron, so we still have a Jewish community in the heart of the city of Hebron. Others moved to Kiryat Arba. So here we have two dynamics. People who used to live or had land and returned, and this was also true to the settlements or communities in the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. And those who were very ideologically motivated to go, especially into the holy sites, holy cities of the West Bank. But that was not all. By late 1967, early 1968, the Israeli government realized that there's no peace process, there are no negotiations, and they're going to hold on to this land. So, what to do with it? And the Israeli government adopted what came to be known as the Alon plan. Yigal Alon was commander in the Haganah, later on a general in the IDF, a minister in the Israeli government. And he laid out general principles. Later he said he had nothing to do with it, but it's known as the Alon plan. And they identified certain crucial areas that are important strategically or for security reasons. And there Israel should build settlements for those reasons. And the rest of the territory, they should do nothing. And the areas that they identified was the Golan Heights, which they viewed as a security buffer between Syria and Israel. East Jerusalem, which was already annexed. And the Jordan Valley in the West Bank, on the banks of the Jordan River, on the eastern front. And so in those areas, the Golan Heights and the Jordan River, the Israeli government began building settlements. And these were designed by the government, built by the government, and some of them are kibbutzim, they're part of the kibbutz movement. In the case of the Golan Heights, some of them are even Shomer Tzair kibbutzim, which are on the left flank of the political map in Israel. So those who came to live in those settlements, in the Golan Heights, then in the Jordan River Valley, were secular kibbutzniks, laborites, not necessarily driven by the same ideology that brought the people into the city of Hebron, for example. They were very different. So this will also set a type of pattern for us. And so, by 1972, we had the following. In the West Bank, we had about 1,100 Jews living in all of the West Bank, most of them in the Jordan River Valley. In the Gaza Strip, there were about 700 Jews living. In the Golan Heights, very few, just under 100 at that point. It will grow. And in East Jerusalem, almost 9,000 Jews. The neighborhoods that were being built in East Jerusalem. Now, under the Israeli government, East Jerusalem, these were not settlements. There was absolutely no debate about building neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, because East Jerusalem was now seen as an integral part of the state of Israel. However, for the international community, including the United States, there is no difference. East Jerusalem and the West Bank are seen as the same thing. 3 years ago, when Joe Biden was visiting Israel, and the Ministry of the Interior published that they were going to build 200 new units in East Jerusalem, Joe Biden almost left the country immediately in protest. So again, for the United States, it would seem, based on Joe Biden's reaction, there is no line differentiating, technically, between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. All those territories are considered one general entity. So labor was in control from 1967, for our purposes, all the way until 1977, when Likud came into power. And roughly by 1977, we are talking about a population, excluding East Jerusalem, of about 10,000, and in East Jerusalem about 20,000 Israeli residents. So not an overwhelming number by any stretch of the imagination. But then the Likud came into power. And the Likud had a very different political platform than Labour. The Likud were champions of what came to be known as Greater Israel. They never supported, up until that point, any negotiations over those territories. In fact, if you go and read the political platform of the Likud in 1977, it still claimed that Israel had the right to both banks of the Jordan River, including the eastern bank of the Jordan River. This was only removed from the Likud platform in 1980. So the Likud had absolutely no intention at that point of negotiating over the West Bank. What he did have, and this was a surprise to the entire world, that it was willing to negotiate with the Egyptians a peace agreement. And as soon as Likud came into power under the leadership of Menachem Begin, they engaged in very serious negotiations with the Egyptians that culminated 2 years later in a peace agreement whereby Israel returned the entire Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, including removing some Jewish settlements that were built in the Sinai Peninsula. So several thousand Israelis who lived in the Sinai Peninsula were brought back into Israel. But at the same time, the Likud deepened very much its hold over the West Bank and at that time also the Gaza Strip. There were several dynamics. By the time the Likud came to power, there was a very strong ideological movement of settlers. I told you about the case of Hebron in 1968. By 1974, a new group was created. It was called Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Believers. And this was a well-organized group committed to building Jewish settlements in the heart of the West Bank. Not following the logic of the Alon plan, that called for strategic or security areas, but they wanted to settle in the heart of the West Bank, in the heart of Palestinian cities, and in sites that had religious significance, biblical significance. And they engaged in building those settlements starting in 1974. Usually it involved conflict with the government and the IDF, but they proved to be very persistent, and they had some lobbyists within the government. Chief among them was Shimon Peres, who was then the defense minister from 1974 to 1977. And so they were able to build some settlements in the greater Ramallah area, in the greater Nablus area, very close to Jenin, and other areas in the heart of the Middle East, of the West Bank, and they were driven by ideology. This was what brought them. They said, we are redeeming the land. We are here for religious, messianic reasons. And there were several thousand of them, so they were not a mass of people. What they were highly committed and ideologically driven to do so. So they were a force, and once Likud came into power, they were very much embraced now by the government and were granted much more authority and the ability to operate from within the mainstream. But then the Likud engaged on another plan. They wanted to increase dramatically the number of the Jewish settlers, Jewish Israeli citizens living in the West Bank, and to a lesser degree in the Gaza Strip. And what they did is a plan that was basically conceived by then the Minister of Housing, Ariel Sharon. And his plan was to obliterate the Green Line, or the line that demarked the border between the West Bank and Israel. How to do it? Built as many settlements close to the Green Line. By the way, on both sides of the Green Line, rendering the line meaningless. And so this is something that the Israeli government did in earnest in the years between 1977 and 1983. So most of the 121 officially recognized settlements were built or started during those years. between 1977 and 1983. Now, they were building all those settlements, and they needed to draw people in. So how did they go about advertising those newly created settlements? What was the pull? And there was a massive advertising campaign to bring settlers into them. There was no ideology involved, no religion involved, none of that. The slogan was either 5 minutes from Jerusalem or 5 minutes from Kfar Saba, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. Basically, the government was selling those settlements as suburbs. These are the new suburbs of Jerusalem or the greater Tel Aviv area. And we call on you, Israelis, come, we'll give you much better opportunities. Here we have to take into account what happened in the elections of 1977. What brought Likud into power of 1977 was not an ideological shift in Israel. It's not that Israel shifted from left-wing politics to right-wing politics necessarily in 1977. The most important shift in voting patterns that happened both in 1973 and then in 1977 is that Mizrahim, the Israeli Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries, shifted their vote from Labor to Likud for a host of reasons. And Mizrahim in Israel tended to be poorer, working class, and they voted en masse for Likud in 1977. They are the reason that Likud formed the government in 1977. And between 1977 and 1985, the majority of people who moved into those newly created settlements, and those settlements, I urge you to look online at pictures from those settlements, they look like American subdivisions. It's houses with great roofs and small gardens. This was the new Israeli dream, and it was the lower working class, mainly Mizrahim, who moved into those settlements. They did not move there for ideological reasons. Most of them did not see themselves as redeemers of the land. They moved there because the mortgage rates were much, much better, because taxes there were much, much lower, and there were other incentives to move there. And so the first major jump in the Jewish population in the West Bank happened following this major kind of migration into the West Bank. And so, for example, by 1983, we're already talking about 22,800 Jews living in the West Bank. So this is already a massive jump in the beginning of much bigger population. But notice by 1985, it's already 44,000. So this is not natural growth. These are Israelis moving into those settlements. And again, if you look at, let's say, this map, which kind of give you where all the clusters of settlements are. Notice where they are. They are surrounding the city of Jerusalem. So they are within commuting distance of the city of Jerusalem. And they're on the western edge of the West Bank, within very close commuting distance of the greater Tel Aviv area. And this is where the overwhelming majority of the Jewish population in the West Bank lives until this very day. If you see those isolated triangles in the heart of the West Bank, those tend to be those ideologically driven settlements. But the majority of the population does not live there. They live in those bigger clusters of settlements. One other thing that we need to take into account is that at that time, the West Bank, and to a large degree Gaza, was fairly peaceful. There was very little violence going on. The majority of a substantial number of the Arab population of the West Bank and Gaza worked in Israel regularly and commuted to Israel from the West Bank and Gaza on a daily basis. And there were no checkpoints or barriers, none whatsoever. So in fact, you had no way of telling on what side of the green line you were at that time. There was no physical barrier. And you can basically travel anywhere and everywhere. And so if you lived there, commuting to either Jerusalem or Tel Aviv was very easy, it was very simple. No obstacles there. So this was the first major wave of expansion. The second major wave of expansion in the population came in the early 1990s. This is when Israel experienced massive waves of immigration from the former Soviet Union. And at that time, in the early 1990s, the Jewish population in the West Bank basically doubled. In 1985, there were 44,000. By 1992, there were 101,000. And by 2000, there were close to 200,000 Jews living in the West Bank. One of the biggest jumps were immigrants, Jews who came to Israel from the former Soviet Union, and again encouraged, given incentives by the government to go and live in the West Bank, which many of them chose to do. Again, in most cases, we're not talking about the growth of ideological settlers or people who came for religious reasons. They came because of cost of living, quality of life issues, and other questions that were relevant to them at that time. We also know that the American administration of the time was very upset by Israeli policies in the West Bank. We know it because there was a major clash between the Bush administration and the Shamir government in the early 1990s. If you recall, Israel asked for loan guarantees when the massive immigration from the former Soviet Union began. They asked for $10 billion in guaranteed loans. And the Bush administration, mainly Secretary of State Baker, James Baker, said, we'll do it if you will freeze all expansion in the West Bank settlements, which the Shamir government refused to do, and therefore denied most of those loan guarantees. And some political commentators argued that this helped bring in the Rabin government later on in 1992, this clash between the U.S. administration and the Likud government in 1992 over this very question of freezing all expansion of settlements. I would like to add again, by 1983, Israel almost stopped building new settlements. There are exceptions. What it has been doing since is expanding the existing settlements. Most of the newly created outposts are not recognized by the State of Israel and considered by the Israeli courts to be basically illegal since that time. So that's the next phase. We'll get to what the Rabin government did next.
Are those mostly religious, the ones that are illegal, created by the
Yes, yes. The population is very small in Israel. Sometimes we're talking about 7, 8 people surrounded by a few anti-structures. The next and biggest wave to date of movement from Israel to the West Bank are the ultra-Orthodox. Over the past 10 years, the fastest growing population in the West Bank are ultra-Orthodox Jews. Most ultra-Orthodox Jews, and this is the poorest community in Israel, the poorest Jewish community in Israel. The Bedouins are poor, but they're the second poorest community. They rely heavily on government housing. And basically, almost all government housing for ultra-Orthodox Jews over the past 10 years has focused on the West Bank. The two biggest Jewish cities in the West Bank are ultra-Orthodox cities, Modi'in Illit and Beitar Illit. Right now, the estimates are that about 33% of all Jewish settlers in the West Bank are ultra-Orthodox. They average 6.5 kids per family. The overall average for Jews in the West Bank is about 3.5, but they skew it up. So for the non-ultra-Orthodox, the average is about 2.5. So by all estimates, by 2020, the majority of the Jews in the West Bank will be ultra-Orthodox. What is interesting is that officially, the ultra-Orthodox are either anti-Zionist or a-Zionist. And many of them don't fully recognize the State of Israel for their religious reasons. So clearly, they are not there for ideological reasons. They are not Zionist pioneers. They are there because this is where the available housing exists.
Can I also suggest, aren't they also there because by being in the West Bank, they can control who moves to their community in a way they wouldn't if they were in main Israel?
They have a few inside of Israel, and they control it fairly well. But that's maybe part of it, yes. But so they are the fastest growing, and they will be the majority by 2020 by all estimates. So we need to take this into consideration. Okay. So, negotiations proposals. So I said, after 1967, there were basically no negotiations over the West Bank and Gaza, over those territories. Nothing happened. Then in 1977, Israel began negotiating with the Egyptians. The Egyptians insisted on including the Palestinians in the peace agreement. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but half of the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt includes the issue of the Palestinians, though very little of it has been implemented, and it kind of fizzled and did not change the situation on the ground. However, starting in 1991, under initially American pressure, more serious negotiations started over the future of those territories and the possibility of the creation of maybe a Palestinian state. This also coincided with the PLO in 1988 declaring that it accepts the parameters of UN Resolution Security Council 242, meaning de facto they recognize the state of Israel, though at this time they didn't say that, they'll wait till 1994. And so the path was opened to a potential agreement that might include maybe a Palestinian state in those territories. This was, of course, intensified when the Oslo agreements were signed in 1993 and then Oslo B in 1994. Now, both Oslo agreements did not specify what's going to happen in those territories. It said that those decisions will be made when the final status agreement will be negotiated and signed within a matter of 5 years. But what it did do is it divided the West Bank into 3 areas, and we do have a map that covers this somewhere, into areas A, B, and C. Yes, so this will be one of those maps. So the West Bank was now divided into those 3 areas. Area A, which includes the 8 major Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and included at the time Gaza. It's no longer relevant because there's no Israeli presence in Gaza anymore, are Area A, meaning they're under full civil control of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority runs all the civic services in those territories, and also under the security control of the Palestinian police force. Officially, there is no Israeli security